Once upon a time, there was an average American family living in an average American town. After the family moved, the father left his familiar carpool and began a long solo commute to work. And gradually, he began to change. He looked the same, he dressed the same, but something was very different. But this isn't a story about just one man. It's the story about a media phenomenon that changed a father and divided a nation.
Here's my dad with me when I was a baby. He really loved me. This was in Arizona where I was born. He was goofy, like a lot of other dads, I guess. My dad was a really fun dad. All the kids in the neighborhood really liked him because he was funny and told jokes and would play with us. He was a really good dad. He loved animals. He could always be counted on to help persuade my mom if we wanted another pet. For vacations, my dad took us on camping trips. It was a lot of fun. My mom didn't like it so much. She didn't really like roughing it, but we all still had a really great time. He came from humble roots. He never had any bad words about any race, people, or person. I remember this one time when we all went to New York. We got outside Port Authority, and there was an African-American homeless man, and he asked my dad for some money. My father gave him what was at that time a decent amount of money and called him sir. That made such an impression on me and taught me you treat everybody with respect. We weren't really a political family. My dad was a non-political Kennedy Democrat. But then, when he started listening to talk radio, I saw him change. A lot. You used to consider yourself a Democrat, right?
Yeah, before I knew anything, I had any sense. I was stupid then. I was listening to people all the time, and bullshit, and they didn't know what they were talking about. Until then, I was fat, dumb, and happy.
I think I first noticed something different about him when I came down to visit. I was working in New York at the time. He picked me up at the bus station and was driving me back to the house. On the ride home, we passed a Hooters. He mentioned that he was really pissed off that some feminazis did not want women with their breasts hanging out to be working at Hooters. I said something like, well, maybe the feminists have a point. He was so mad, he threatened to pull the car over and let me hitchhike home. I was very surprised because I was thinking, I bet he never even walked into a Hooters before. He became really angry about stuff that I didn't know he ever even gave a thought to. Like, you know, Hooters.
Whether they're in jail or not, they are appropriating their own kind.
That's why we should go in there and stop them before they destroy our country.
When we moved and he had a very long commute by car, he would listen to the radio on the long drive. Then he started to change.
You know, the feminazis began their quest to make women more like men, dress like us, acquire power like us, have careers like us, all that.
Rush Limbaugh is one of my heroes. I agree with him in politics.
And then his Rush Limbaugh-loving buddy told him he could listen to more talk radio at night with a tiny portable radio and earbuds. But it would still disturb my mother. So he decided to move into the other bedroom. And then it got worse after he discovered Fox News. His new beliefs came first. It was almost like he joined a cult or had a new religion.
Frank is the family pest. He has to force his political views on all of us.
I did it Frank's way. It was his way or the highway when it came to politics.
I was not aware that Frank had strong political leanings one way or the other. It was just pretty much food and family was what he was interested in.
After emailing came in, yeah, then you get all kinds. I would get political emails too, but they were factual, bringing things up to date, where Dad's emails were hateful against Democrats, and he would forward them to me and the children and ask him, please, don't send these emails or I'll block you.
He started getting fanatical.
Oh, he would send some nasty email back like, F you, or you guys are full of S blank blank T.
I started getting his emails and I got 394 emails. I really thought there was somebody else other than Frank Senko sending these things. And in fact, he didn't author any of these. They were just, recycled things that he received from his other right-wing cronies. I was wondering what happened to Frank since the time I saw him.
I'd always thought that he was capable of deeply thinking about issues, but it was apparent at that point that it's not that he wasn't capable of it, he wasn't interested in it. And that to me was a dangerous signal.
The brain is not only being washed, as they say, just being dry cleaned.
So what did happen to Dad? Was he brainwashed? I didn't know. This went on for years. So I finally decided to make a film to figure it out.
Jennifer, is this your book?
Yes.
He's my hero.
Why is he your hero?
Politically, I agree with him beautifully. I always agree with him.
We knew better than to discuss politics together, because it would just end in arguments and bitterness.
I had a Kickstarter campaign to raise some money, and before I knew it, people were coming out of the woodwork, contacting me from all over the country, telling me similar stories. And I thought, wow, this is a real phenomenon.
They just drummed into her what they wanted her to hear. She's a completely different person.
My brother became very fact resistant.
My reaction was, who are you and what have you done with my stepfather?
Disjointed existence.
And he was completely changed. He was bitter and angry.
At one point, he threatened to get a bus because
he
it was
became
challenging.
Obsessed.
And she had never been like that.
He was carrying a small pistol.
She was not hateful.
Shot twice into
Broke my heart to see my parents.
Very loving and caring.
I feel I don't really know these people anymore.
Just goes on these tirades.
Fundamentally senseless.
I spoke with each one and found we all had one thing in common. Someone close to us became enraged and unreachable after excessively listening to or watching right-wing media. How did this happen?
The great story here, for anybody willing to find it and write about it and explain it, is this vast right-wing conspiracy.
Decades ago, I was a junior hippie. My big brother was the real thing with hair down to his waist. I witnessed and felt part of the social revolution happening at that time, and I believed our country was going in a more open direction. Years later, when Reagan came in, I could feel the country was shifting to a more hardened place. And that's around the time my dad started to change. Wouldn't have necessarily thought to go all the way back to the 60s, but author Claire Connor, who wrote Wrapped in the Flag, contacted me after she saw my trailer. Her personal experience with the John Birch Society helped put into place a major piece of the puzzle.
The John Birch Society came out of the McCarthy era and was built on this concept that the communist menace was right around the corner. Very quickly, the John Birch Society moved from those bad guys over in the Soviet Union, China, or in Cuba, to the idea that we had those bad guys right in our own government.
In 1964, Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had many Birch supporters. But this damaged him because, years earlier, word had leaked out that their founder, Robert Welch, had written a secret book branding sitting Republican president and World War II hero Dwight D. Eisenhower a communist. The Birches were labeled as nutty extremists. Goldwater and his platform were hammered by Lyndon Johnson. The right wing was declared dead. So they started to hit back. One of the most powerful ways was through creating their own media.
I first spotted David Brock in a documentary called The Hunting of the President. He had been a conservative operative involved in the organized effort of trying to take President Clinton down. But he came to regret it and wrote about what he learned from an insider's view. When I read his book, The Republican Noise Machine, I knew I had to talk to him. It took me 1.5 years to get him, but I finally got to interview David Brock.
One of the very first things that the conservative movement did in trying to get control of the debate in the country was to do that through the media. And they established a couple of different organizations that market the notion of liberal media bias to the public. And so one of them is called Accuracy in Media, by someone named Rita Irvine, who had worked in the Nixon administration. And basically the idea behind this group was to counter their feeling that the media was opposed to Nixon's policies in Vietnam.
More certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
You could see how the campaign to discredit the media would lay the groundwork for a vast alternative media that would come later.
One night I was watching Bill Moyers on Channel 13, and I learned about the role of Roger Ailes.
And I went back to the Nixon administration, and Roger Ailes was in who's the chairman of Fox News, was in the Nixon administration.
He was Nixon's television advisor.
Absolutely.
Then I found Gabriel Sherman. He was the guy to talk to about Roger Ailes, for sure.
Roger Ailes understood that TV is about one thing. It's about emotion, and you need to communicate to the audience and hook into them on an emotional level. And Richard Nixon, who by all accounts was a very smart, a brilliant man who had a command of the issues, he couldn't connect with the audience. You know, he came off as stiff, as shifty-eyed, as famously in the 1960 presidential debate against John Kennedy, he was sweating. It was a terrible performance. Then he meets Roger Ailes in 1968. At the time, Roger Ailes was a young producer, the wonderkind of television at the age of 26. And so Roger Ailes coached Richard Nixon on how to communicate those ideas to the average American who was watching television every night at dinner table. Richard Nixon, whose political career almost blew up because of television, was able to win the presidency because he mastered it. At the time, in the late 1960s, TV had finally become a mass medium, and yet there really weren't people who had decoded the medium. Roger Ailes told Nixon that to appeal to the audience, he needed to use short, snappy one-liners that can stick in the audience's mind.
A great philosophy is never won without defeat. It is always won without fear.
And so really, Roger Ailes was a pioneer in the whole art of the soundbite. He told Nixon that America is dumb. So give them something simple, boil it down, and they'll get it.
Ailes was so involved with advising the administration, he even outlined Nixon's role in the lighting of the White House Christmas tree. But his designs for the GOP went much deeper. Ailes was outlining a way to avoid, quote, the censorship, the priorities, and the prejudices of network news selectors and disseminators. Written in 1970, this memo talks about how television had become the most powerful news source because people are lazy and want their thinking done for them. It became the blueprint for Fox News, and although its authorship is unclear, Roger Ailes' handwritten notes are seen throughout the document.
There are simple things that the American people believe in. It's the reason John Wayne is still the top one in the top 5 movie stars of all time. He's been dead for 40 years. But you always knew about him. Don't touch my woman, don't steal my horse, and don't ever draw a gun on me. Otherwise, we're going to get along fine.
It offers you a little action.
Roger Ailes was fired from the White House for seeming like he could go too rogue. Basically, he was caught talking behind Richard Nixon's back to author Joe McGinnis. After that, Ailes started working for TVN, a television news network owned by the Coors family.
Their goal
was to be like a tugboat to the Queen Mary. They were just going to be going along and pushing the boat a little further to the right and a little further to the right, and their goal was ultimately to put the great ship over as far right as they could. And Ailes was working for them at the time, and he didn't know much about news. I'm not even sure I know that he knows much about news now, but he sure does know television. He's as good as television as anyone in the country, and he's a great propagandist.
By the way, the motto they came up with was fair and balanced.
My father and my stepmother used to be very loving and caring, patient, very kind-hearted, Christian-based individuals. And we noticed that they became more hostile towards people that were not believing the way that they did. Their conversation became very hateful.
The brilliance of Nixon was to bend a politics that was based on deference to money and plutocracy, and frame it in terms of a kind of cultural populism. The idea that the real snobs are not the people who hire and fire, but the people who kind of decide cultural trends.
When Nixon was running for president, he had a problem. In 1964, Goldwater lost. Conservative was a dirty word. Everybody wanted to be a liberal. Nixon comes along in '67 and he says, we got to get working people to vote for Nixon. How do we do this?
Between 1964 and 67, the anti-war movement felt like a betrayal to many veterans who saw it as unpatriotic. Nixon seized on this and was openly hostile to the protesters. At the same time, women were pushing the boundaries of societal norms, which dictated they stay at home, raise children, and dress like ladies. Nixon came out for traditional family values, thus capturing the vote of the working men who felt threatened and didn't like what they saw as radical feminism. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Nixon capitalized on both racist and economic fears of whites and ran against school busing and for law and order.
The Republicans could change the party labels in the South by appealing to the racism and the strong opposition to the civil rights legislation and making that their stand.
In the spring of 1970, after Nixon orders the invasion of Cambodia, which was the instigation for the same protests at Kent State University that led to the deaths of the 4 students. One of the protests was at Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan. And right in the middle of this anti-war rally, this almost marauding army of construction workers came marching in their hard hats, and started beating the protesters with their hard hats. It was all captured on film. It was on the evening news. Rather than excoriating these basically vigilantes, Richard Nixon invites the head of construction trades in New York, Peter Brennan, and Peter Brennan presents the commander-in-chief with a ceremonial hard hat. So he's almost kind of throwing his lot with the people who are beating the protesters.
He created conservative populism. We're going to bring them together and have them vote on the basis of their morality against their self-interest. It's not vote on their economics, but vote on the moral issues.
So that was Nixon's contribution in pushing the country a little further to the right. In the meantime, my little brother and I had both got into the hippie culture. Even my dad kind of did.
In the 60s, you had the Voters' Rights Act and Civil Rights Act. All this happened in about a 10, 11-year period, you know. By 71, you had cities burning because people were saying the change is not happening fast enough. Virtually every group in America, other than wealthy white guys, was in open revolt and calling for change. Now, it wasn't tear down the government change. I mean, this is being covered by the CBS Evening News and Walter Cronkite.
I was so lucky to be introduced to Jeff Cohen. Aside from being a first-rate journalist and author, he was a former commentator at Fox News and an all-around mensch.
As a result of these movements for social change, especially among young people, there was a real backlash in the elite centers of conservative power and corporate power. And one of the symbols of this backlash was a memo written by the general counsel, whose name was Lewis Powell.
It was starting to get really interesting. This confidential Lewis Powell memo was from August 1971, just a year after the Roger Ailes memo.
And so Lewis Powell wrote a memo to the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce saying Americans view business as the big bad guys and people like Ralph Nader as the heroes.
What he claimed is that the whole country is being taken over by the radical left, the government, the media, the universities, of course.
He said basically the following: we have a problem. Our best and brightest of our students do not want to become conservative businessmen. We have to change this. We have to get wealthy conservatives to put their money together to appoint professors in major universities to teach our principles. We have to set up and support organizations in major universities to do this. They said we can't trust the universities. We have to set up our own research establishments, which became the think tanks. We have to make sure that they get published. Start journals, start publishing houses so they can publish their books. And we have to buy media so their ideas can get out.
These were right-wing think tanks putting forward stuff that basically wasn't academically sound or intellectually sound, but had good propaganda value. Powell, after writing the memo, was appointed by Nixon to be on the Supreme Court. So they set up this infrastructure, and then ultimately it led to the right-wing media itself, where they were setting up their own channels of communication. And that was the big boom in right-wing talk radio nationally and across the country in every locale, and ultimately Fox News Channel.
This Lewis Powell memo was extremely influential. It impacted the realms of politics, judicial law, media, and education.
They have regular meetings of various kinds. The best known are the Grover Norquist Wednesday morning meetings. Now, this has been going on for a good 20 years. Norquist was so proud of his meetings, he invited my students to attend them for 3 months.
There were people there from groups that represented the full gamut of political issues on the right, from fair trade commissions to evangelicals. The real genius of the meeting is that you can get these dozens of people who might not otherwise agree into the same room every 7 days, talking and sort of ironing out their differences. As long as you're on board with pro-life, pro-gun, and anti-tax agenda, you're with us.
Writing up talking points, which then get sent out to all the people who are around the country who are going to be booked on radio and TV. And by 5 o'clock tonight, everybody's saying the same thing.
We'll take on Obamacare regulations that threaten the 40-hour work week.
Let's put on his desk things like restore the 40-hour work week.
The loss of the 40-hour work week, big mistake. That ought to be restored.
We must take action and restore the traditional 40-hour work week.
And by 10 o'clock, it's on The Daily Show.
Obamacare will destroy all that we once held dear in this country by requiring health insurance from employers for the 15% of Americans who don't currently get that. The law only applies to full-time workers, people who work 30 or more hours a week. Guess what?
A lot of employers are saying we don't want to pay for these health care benefits, so we're going to move full-time workers to part-time workers.
The Powell Memorandum was written in 1971, and the Heritage Foundation started in 1973. The effect of having conservative think tanks clearly outgunning and outnumbering and outfunding the think tanks of the left has been much more effective in dominating policy discussions.
There was a universal agreement that the goal of journalism was objectivity and to discern the truth of conflicting claims. The conservatives moved the argument from objectivity to one of balance. Under the rubric of balance, the conservatives do better because the way the media now treats balance is there's 99% of scientific consensus on global warming and 1% of scientists funded by the coal industry to say that's not true, but they're presented in a balanced way, giving credit to both sides. And so the conservatives were able to infiltrate the op-ed pages of the country on the same notion that, well, you have liberal columnists, you need conservative columnists.
So when Hillary Clinton referred to the vast right-wing conspiracy, I believe she had in mind the full gamut of conservative organizations, from legal foundations to media organizations to think tanks to advocacy groups, and including Wednesday meeting as its linchpin. After that, people call the Norquist meeting the headquarters of the vast right-wing conspiracy.
The stage was now set for Ronald Reagan to give the greatest performance of his career, selling the American people on supply-side trickle-down economics.
The economic ills we suffer have come upon us over several decades. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
You know, we keep hearing about trickle-down economics and Reaganomics and how if you help the people at the top, the wealth and income will trickle down. And Studs Terkel said, the only thing I've seen trickle down in the 1980s is meanness. And what he meant was, you know, the kind of country club looking down on people less fortunate than you had sort of gone, and thanks to Limbaugh and Bob Grant and people like that, sort of like they were aiming at making white males, middle-class males, to be as angry and looking down on people and being angry at these social movements as anyone who used to be in a country club in the 1950s. That was what was disseminated, was this mean, angry streak. That's what the 1980s did, according to Studs Terkel. You know, the Reagan Revolution pulled people. Was your dad ever a Democrat?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Right, it pulled a lot of working class Democrats. The Reagan Revolution, they started voting Republican. They were called Reagan Democrats.
There are two things that made Democrats willing to vote for Ronald Reagan. Reagan developed this political vocabulary that made traditional conservative economic ideas sound really positive and really good to ordinary people. And what Ronald Reagan was promising these voters was a return to a simpler time.
The America they want to take us back to is mythic. So you might want to say the place they want to take us back to is like Brigadoon. You know, it's this kind of sort of shimmering vision that, you know, kind of exists in the space of the imagination.
They saw 1900 in America as like the apex of when we were great as a nation. 1900. Before the income tax, before the Federal Reserve, before any progressive legislation was considered or passed, before child labor laws, before women had any rights, before women even had the right to vote. Robert Welsh, who was the founder of the John Birch Society, talked a lot about 1900 as this glorious time in American history. And he said, there were pockets of poverty, but it was a healthy kind of poverty. Poverty free from government interference, where every man understood that relief from dire want was entirely his own responsibility. Thus, the blessings of liberty outweighed the poverty.
Like during the Great Depression, when people would come to our house and go around to the back door and ask my mother if they could have the meal, and she'd cook them bacon and eggs or something, they'd eat it on the back. So that's how people had to survive. Maybe he wants to go back to that, I don't know.
We had like a one-room school, you know, and we'd walk to school in our bare feet, you know, and that's how we lived.
Looking back, I know that we lived in poverty or pretty close to it all the time. But we didn't know that at the time because the government didn't come around and tell us we were poor.
One of the brilliant innovations was a new theory about how taxation worked. about how the economy worked. It used to be that conservatives, that Republicans were all about balanced budgets. They were all about kind of making the people eat their spinach. But they came up with this new theory called supply side economics. And supply side basically means you give money to business. And that way they'll basically produce more plenty that will trickle down to the ordinary people. And that was what George Bush in 1980 referred to as voodoo economics, because it almost did sound like magic. It was kind of like he was promising you the candy store. He said he could lower everybody's taxes, and by doing so, everyone would benefit. It was like the miracle of the loaves and fishes. In actual fact, how it ended up turning out was, hurting the very working class voters who trusted Ronald Reagan with their economic future. Of course, inequality just skyrocketed. The rich got richer, and ordinary people's wages ended up stagnating.
And my dad thought Reagan was the best guy in the world, and he was a Democrat. And somewhere in this Reagan-Bush change, he told me, well, I'm a Republican now. I realized how wrong I was all those years ago. And the only thing I could attribute the change to was his change in taste about the news stories he watched. We used to watch Cronkite and Brinkley and Brokaw and what I consider sort of middle America, middle ground views. And later on, all he watched was Fox.
And the Fairness Doctrine actually said that you have to program in the public interest. And so as a result of that, radio and television stations had real news.
It operated for 50 years. In 1949, it was actually voted in as law by the US Congress. It said if you are watching or listening to your local television or radio station, and there are points of view that are not being included in a discussion, and you wish for them to be in there, go complain to your station. If they don't give you satisfaction, then send a complaint to the FCC. It didn't guarantee equal time. It reminded broadcasters that they had a public trust, that they should include some views that might go against their own or that might not be popular or favorable to them. It was dropped in the 80s by the Reagan administration.
The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine ended up resulting in an explosion of talk radio.
In 1987, I couldn't believe what I heard. I'd hear overt gutter racism. And this was coming from different talk show hosts, but the main one was Bob Grant. I would hear black people referred to as savages.
The savage mind, the primitive primordial mentality, being immature, anything they think they can get away with, they will press and press and press, which of course is what they've been doing all over the United States of America, not in just...
The allure of the Limbaughs and the Grants is that they tap into a kind of resentment, a kind of insecurity on the part of mostly white men, in large part middle-aged and aging white men, a kind of injured pride that the world is passing them by. It's typical of demagoguery to say that your problems really aren't problems caused by you, they're caused by these other people that aren't like us.
He found out that I was dating somebody who wasn't white and just was like, I can't, you just don't agree with any of my values. You don't believe any of the conservative things that I do. And you're so far left that you're willing to date people outside of your race. And I love you, but I just can't talk to you ever again.
Talk radio was always in the hands of right-wing backlash artists.
A bunch of white guys on the right railing against the women's movement, the civil rights movement.
So that's the beginning of talk radio that people forget about. It was all local then. There was no national. It never went national until Rush Limbaugh, really made it national beginning in 1988.
I learned that Fox, God love them, is televising this speech on the Fox News channel. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, this is my first ever address to the nation.
Ah, Rush Limbaugh, my dad's hero. I heard him say it so many times. The way my dad spoke of Rush is like he found a new religion, quoting him constantly as if he were the word of God.
Talk radio is so influential, and Rush Limbaugh is especially good. That me, a walking encyclopedia that basically could debunk things on the spot, in many cases with talk radio hosts, Limbaugh sounded so confident that they actually sent me back to the books. You know, I would be right in the end, but I wasn't sure I was right because of the absolute confidence that this guy exudes, and it's very affecting.
I'll never forget, my dad sent me something in the mail. He had put a PETA label on it, and he had taken a black magic marker and rubbed out PETA, like just scribbled it and scribbled it and scribbled it until he almost ruined the envelope, and the PETA thing was out. It was just crazy. He was an animal lover. He always was an animal lover. It just filled up all of him. It became all of who he was. Like, it really is if he were a cult member, and that's why I use the term brainwashing.
And he said to me, I don't care what your facts are, my beliefs matter more, and I believe Rush.
Limbaugh, every day when he works. When I became involved with Occupy Wall Street, my parents were furious, and when my parents heard bits and pieces about my involvement, they cut me off completely, didn't speak to me.
My dad has been a trucker for the last 40 years.
Who does he listen to?
Rush Limbaugh, and he's pretty much become unbearable.
President Obama had just come into office the first time. The economy was in the toilet, so I felt it was safe to discuss the economy because clearly President Obama couldn't have had anything to do with it. It was too soon. And my uncle got very upset. He says, "You get out of my house. You can't stay here and talk to me about that guy." He walked towards me and was carrying a small pistol. I saw the gun pointing at me, and he dropped his hand to the floor and shot twice into the ground.
Most people don't think about this, but talk radio is something, unlike a lot of other media, that's done alone. People listen to it alone, and they're listening to this one other person. And there's sort of a personal thing there and a connection.
People who are on the radio and TV are there for one reason only, and that's to make you mad. And the formula for making you, the viewer or the listener, mad hasn't changed a bit, yet people keep falling for it. If you embellish the opinion with confidence and cockiness, then you're getting into generating hatred. The law of averages indicates that half the people who listen to you are not going to like you. You're still going to find a way to make those who don't like you enjoy listening to your program. A lot of people say, "You really believe the stuff you say?" I don't know, it's for you to figure out.
Excuse me?
A lot of people say, "You really believe the stuff you say?" I don't know, it's for you to figure out.
Limbaugh was telling people for years, you're right to be prejudiced. You're right to be angry. Listen to what the feminazis are telling you now. Or these environmental wackos who say that cigarettes secondhand smoke. You know, and then he'll make up some study.
One day, years ago, when my dad was at the height of his Limbaugh lunch days, I went down to visit my parents, and my mom and dad and I went to our favorite restaurant, Old Time Tavern. As we were walking towards the restaurant door, there was a bench outside where several people were seated smoking. As we passed them, my dad stopped to talk to them. He inhaled the smoke and said, I love the smell of cigarette smoke. It reminds me of the time I used to smoke. I was stunned because the only thing I ever remember my dad smoking was the occasional pipe. He also hated wearing seatbelts and would absolutely refuse to wear one even after he got a ticket. Something told me it had to do with Rush Limbaugh.
He wasn't just wrong factually, he would take like reality upside down. He became what we call a champion of the overdog. Any powerful group that was being criticized by scientists or medical people was the victim. So the tobacco industry was a victim. And that's where he came up with his concoction that, you know, no one's ever proved that nicotine is addictive or is linked to these horrible diseases. There's no science involved. And, you know, cigarettes, secondhand smoke, making you go outside of the restaurant to smoke, it's not true. Here's the real facts, and then he comes up with his false facts. You don't like seatbelts? It's Ralph Nader. He made up this stuff.
Ladies and gentlemen, the top 10 Limbaugh lies. Number 10,
There are more Native Americans alive today than when Columbus arrived. Number 9. The government is going to have the right to get into your bank account with the health care bill and make transfers without you knowing it. Number 8. Egyptian husbands will soon be legally allowed to have sex with their dead wives for up to 6 hours after their death. Number 7. President Barack Obama shut down the NASA space flights and turned the agency into, quote, a Muslim outreach department, end quote. Number 6. The United States has more forest land than it did in 1787. Number 5. President Obama wants to mandate circumcision. Number 4. There's no conclusive proof that nicotine's addictive. And the same thing with cigarettes causing emphysema, lung cancer, and heart disease. Number 3. If the ice caps melted, the ocean level wouldn't rise. Number 2. Styrofoam is biodegradable. Number 1. I'm not making this stuff up, folks.
How can all these people believe such outlandish statements? But it wasn't just like my dad or Barbara's brother or Maria's uncle who believed Rush Limbaugh that troubled me.
Clarence Thomas, one of our Supreme Court justices, who officiated at the third wedding of Rush Limbaugh. I think it was in Clarence Thomas's house. And Clarence Thomas, tell anyone that asks him, no, I don't listen to mainstream media, I don't trust it. But he taped Rush Limbaugh's radio show all 3 hours and would try to always listen to that. Now imagine this, you're a Supreme Court justice deciding on things like war and peace and civil liberties and gay marriage, and your window to the real news world is Rush Limbaugh's 3-hour monologue. That's pretty damn scary. There was a sense of seamless argumentation that this guy is giving me the complete explanation. And he's got facts and studies to back it up. And I'm listening to him 3.5 hours a day. When we put out our study in 1994 debunking dozens of these lies or distortions or exaggerations from Rush Limbaugh, we encountered thousands of ditto heads. Now, the cult-like nature is obvious when a guy is preaching for hours at a time and people come on, instead of saying amen, but just like saying amen, they say dittos Rush, mega dittos Rush. That's their contribution. It's like, here's the preacher, and I'm part of the cult, the congregation, and I'm just amening with this phrase, dittos or mega dittos Rush. You're the greatest, Rush.
Did they actually say that
themselves? They go on the air and they say, mega dittos Rush.
Oh, that's why they call them ditto heads.
Yes. In other words, everything you say, I'm dittoing.
Hey, Rush, how are you? Mega dittos.
Thank you, and mega dittos, Rush.
Mega
Constitutionist dittos from Southern California, Rush.
So I watched the 30 minutes of Rush Limbaugh, and I didn't like him at first because he was kind of just being critical of Clinton. Well, I had about an hour and 15-minute commute to a factory 2 towns over where I worked, and I worked second shift, and I drove midday to that factory, and I'd catch the last hour of his show. And I just immersed myself. Boom. I was voting down straight Republican ticket. And I had been convinced that Clinton was more corrupt than Nixon ever could have been. Clinton was part of this global initiative to get the UN to control our country. Clinton was going to bring in UN troops to take our guns and put dissidents in concentration camps.
And then Bill Clinton gets elected. There's this backlash against Clinton, spearheaded by Rush Limbaugh. And Limbaugh becomes almost the leader of the opposition. Several times he said on the air that Vince Foster, the White House aide for Bill Clinton, had actually been murdered and that his body was found in Hillary Clinton's apartment. He said that once on the air. So there's weird conspiracy theories, and talk radio is really peaking at that point.
He's incredibly rich.
Well, that's because he signed a contract that gives him approximately $34 million a year. One of those funders we know for a fact in 2011 was the Heritage Foundation because it was listed as a line item on their budget.
I remember when Clinton was president and I came to visit my parents one time. My dad was hunched over in the living room chair reading one of the books against President Clinton. I believe Slick Willie was in the title. You couldn't mention President Clinton without him yelling about how he was a murderer and going to destroy the country. It made me think again of what Hillary Clinton said during that interview when her husband was in office.
This vast right-wing conspiracy that has been conspiring against my husband since the day he announced for president.
I was actually watching it when she said that, and I knew that what she was saying was true. I was involved with and knew very much firsthand that people who I was working with in places like the American Spectator magazine back in 1993, shortly after Clinton was elected, were trying to figure out how to get him thrown out of office, how to impeach him.
On the strength of the backlash against Bill Clinton in his first 2 years, for the first time in decades, the Republicans took over a very low turnout November 1994 election. They made Rush Limbaugh an honorary member of Congress. So the role that Limbaugh and talk radio played in the ascendancy of the right wing in Congress is crucial.
Most of us liked Clinton. At one point, almost 66% of us. But some of my more liberal friends were mad at him for some pro-big business things he did, like signing NAFTA into law and signing legislation that repealed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. The Glass-Steagall Act had been enacted after the Great Depression. Basically, it separated and protected your checkings and savings from investment banks. And that worked for 60 years.
One of the biggest steps forward to handing our whole media system to a handful of corporations was completely bipartisan. It was the 1996 Telecommunications Reform Act, and I put reform in quotes. Consumer rights advocates were calling it the Time Warner Enrichment Act. But President Bill Clinton and the Democrats were getting huge soft money donations from the big media and telecommunications companies. So was the Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. And together, behind closed doors, they developed this Telecommunications Act, which gave away the media to these few big companies. These few fat companies got even fatter. Mainstream media didn't scrutinize it because they were getting rich at the top. And when you have that kind of bipartisan corruption corrupting our media system, it explains why we ended up with the media system we have.
Signing the Telecommunications Act helped set the stage for something even bigger, something that would change the media landscape forever. Remember young Roger Ailes in the Nixon days and that memo called A Plan for Putting the GOP on TV News? In 1996, 25 years later, Fox News was launched with the backing of Rupert Murdoch. Thanks in part to the Telecommunications Act, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp conglomerate grew even larger. And guess whom he hired to create Fox News?
Fox News grew to be the dominant cable news network, and its effect on the other major news stations was profound. Rupert Murdoch is a media giant. He owns news organizations all over the world. These include TV, the internet, magazines, newspapers, and books. That's a lot of influence for one man.
In terms of you having a global media enterprise, I mean, have you shaped that agenda at all?
Obviously, if you're in media and you're concerned with what's going on in the world, you'd like to make a difference by putting forward your opinions.
Excuse me?
If you're in media and you're concerned with what's going on in the world, you'd like to make a difference by putting forward your opinions.
Murdoch may have his empire, but it's Roger Ailes who has the talent.
Fox News is really Roger Ailes' megaphone. And when he comes into work every day, there is a morning meeting that takes place in his office at 8 a.m. And his control over Fox News is so absolute that when he says something, it happens. What happens in 1998? Bill Clinton has an affair with an intern. Well, for an entire year, they do wall-to-wall coverage. What happens in 2000? Another year when Fox News exploded in the ratings. The Bush-Gore recount. How did Ailes cover that story? He covered it as not that it's too close to call and we need to do a recount. He covered it as Al Gore and the Democrats are sore losers and they're trying to steal the election. Fast forward to 2001 and 9/11. How did he cover that story? As a second Pearl Harbor, not that this is a terrorist attack, that there are other ways of dealing with terrorism, law enforcement, targeted strike. Fox News, more than any other media outlet, sold the war as this grand struggle and America was going to go in there and kick ass. And George Bush was this John Wayne figure. I mean, all of the symbolism, the patriotism, the anchors wearing, the flag pins. You know, Roger Ailes knew that these stories, these big stories, could be boiled down to very simple plot lines.
He says things like, if we can convince the audience that we are fair and balanced, we can actually move the audience to the right by introducing kind of right-wing themes surreptitiously.
This is it.
Moving fast, it's damn cold. Fox News is a real, fairly important development because what it does is bring out explicit right-wing views right into the heart of the media and making hardly any pretense at objectivity. It makes sometimes statements of suggesting that it's being fair, but it's blatantly biased, and it has Republican politicians on. It hardly minces words that it has a political agenda. And it's also very important in that it's had an effect on the rest of the media. It was already pretty nice to the right wing, but it has to go even farther to being nice to the right wing.
The most dangerous thing about Fox News is not the fact that it exists and speaks to its audience of a few million people. It's the effect that Fox can have on the rest of the media. Time and again, you will see a false and wrong story that is aired and starts moving through the Fox News channel on a given day, and it bleeding over or spilling over into mainstream institutions of journalism. Media critics coined this term, Fox effect, to mean media is an ecosystem and all media affects other media. And so the existence of Fox News and having that wrong approach to journalism out there has a toxic effect in the rest of journalism.
These are areas which even the government officials have said, these are no-go zones. You don't go in them if you're not a Muslim. There's no law enforcement other than what's enforced by the Muslim communities there.
The French government has created an environment in these certain neighborhoods where they don't allow local law enforcement to come in. These no-go zones in France.
And they become then recruiting grounds. They become a sort of festering region where Islamic extremism can thrive.
Right, so now this extremism could grow in that environment.
So they air the stories, and then they start to bang the drums that the mainstream media is censoring and won't report, to try to pressure and guilt the mainstream media into following their lead.
When I was at Fox News, I can remember sitting in the green room before a show was taped, and a particularly biased segment comes on, and then someone in the green room where we're all waiting, these include Fox News producers, Fox News staff, Fox News contributors. Someone will say, wow, that was really fair and balanced, and the whole place erupts in laughter.
There's actually almost no journalism involved. I mean, when the tsunami hit, Fox News literally couldn't cover it. They didn't have anyone with a camera for days and weeks. They just didn't care. So it's very cheap way to run a, quote, news organization. You just sort of sit around and talk about how awful Democrats are.
Most of Fox's audience is older. However, we were surprised to find out that there were parents and grandparents who introduced their children and grandchildren to it. And we were more surprised to find out that some teenagers were watching Fox.
I had my granddaughter with me the other day. She's 19. She has taxes taken out of her check. And she just came up with this comment. You know, Graham, I don't really like my taxes paying for lazy people who do nothing. And I just was so shocked. I calmly gathered myself and said, hey, do you know why the library's closed on Fridays now? It's because there's no taxes to keep it open.
After reading an article by a 24-year-old ex-Fox devotee, we decided to interview him. The name of his article was...
I was a teenage Fox News robot. Sean Hannity destroyed my childhood. We had one computer with a dial-up modem that was really slow, so it was just faster to get the news off TV back in the day. And so I'd turn on the TV, and that's what started to make me political. And you know, I'd turn the TV on. If I put on CNN or MSNBC, my father would walk by and he'd go, oh, that's liberal propaganda, you gotta watch this. And he would change the channel to Fox News. and then A led to B, and so on.
Years ago, I was dating this nice, lovable, sweet lady, and we broke up. That happens, not a big deal. We stayed in contact, good friends, very sweet, because, you know, she's likable. However, right around the 2004 election, she started watching Fox News, and that sweet, lovable, likable person was gone, and it was replaced, corrupted by Fox into this intolerant, willfully ignorant, compassionless individual. I tried to steer her away from Fox into listening to anything else but Fox, but she got more and more sucked into that foxhole, and now that sweet little person I once knew is gone. And I miss my friend. I wish she'd come back. I wish she'd stop watching.
I basically believed that Bill O'Reilly was sort of like the champion of the rights for the common people, right? Which is totally ridiculous. But at the time I believed it, right? I remember he was arguing that the ACLU was a terrorist organization. Yeah, because they're trying to take away all our rights, which is totally, I mean, patently false, as big of a lie as you could possibly propagate. But he was saying it as if it was true. And I was there in the gym or wherever I was listening to it and be like, oh my God, this guy gets it. You know, this guy gets that if they take away our right to say Merry Christmas, we're no better than the terrorists. And that's the kind of insane bullshit that Fox News gets people to believe.
I never knew there was war on Christmas until my dad started sending us, the whole family, emails about dreaded, horrible, terrible, evil liberals who wanted to kill Christmas, and liberals who didn't even want Christmas trees in schools or red or green allowed anywhere, and whether it was Christmas Day or not, in fact, it usually wasn't Christmas Day, he would just say adamantly, Merry Christmas, wherever he went. To, if he saw somebody in front of a synagogue, let's say, he would say, Merry Christmas, because those damn liberals, they weren't going to take Christmas away from him. There was no happy holidays for Frank Senko, my dad. So I learned how the country was pushed to the right, and a whole new media was created to help that along. My dad and many others got swept up in that tide. I didn't think he was actually brainwashed. Didn't you need brainwashing camps, like where someone is locked away with constant words and images coming at them in their every waking hour? But I wanted to explore that notion. I found neuroscientist Kathleen Taylor from London, who is an expert on brainwashing. I interviewed her via Skype.
There are kind of two ways you can think about brainwash. You can either think of it as this very coercive, forced psychological torture where people are put into situations, put through horrors, and, you know, actually browbeaten into believing or pretending to believe something new. So that's brainwashing by force, if you like. Then there's brainwashing by stealth, which is where it's not so much that they are forced to believe stuff, it's just that all the information that comes at them is pushing a line. And so there is no alternative in terms of information. And if you control the information that goes into a brain, to a great degree you control what that brain is going to do in terms of what the person's going to believe. You're not forcing anybody to believe it, but you're making it difficult for them to think of anything else because their horizons are narrowed. What's happening is that there's a kind of filtration process whereby information comes in and it's checked to see how easily it fits into what's already there.
That brought me back to George Lakoff.
You can only understand what the neural circuits of your brain allow you to understand. Any fact that doesn't fit that will be ignored or rejected as ridiculous and so on. They don't know their brains are being changed. They don't know this mechanism. They're just there, they listen to it.
It slides in and you barely notice because the information's familiar, you don't have to think about it. If those beliefs are very strongly and passionately held, then you may find that any belief that threatens them is just rejected out of hand.
You can't win because it doesn't make any difference how many facts you put out there. It's all about the emotion of anger and hate and fear.
When I think about brainwashing, I tend to think about kind of 5 important factors that are involved in creating this kind of belief change. So those are isolation, control, uncertainty, repetition, and then there's also the use of strong emotions.
It often seemed that my dad was actually addicted to these angry emotions. He just couldn't wait to shut himself off and listen to Rush Limbaugh for 3 hours and get all pissed off.
If you watch something that makes you very angry, you can start getting addicted to that because you get angry, that drives the stress response. Endorphin is released as part of the stress response, and endorphin is the main pleasure chemical in the brain. The tricky thing is it's mostly unconscious. People are sort of tricked, like in the case of your father.
Okay, so clearly the media has a very powerful and profound effect on all of us. So I wondered if there were certain techniques right-wing media especially uses to create that belief change that Kathleen Taylor talks about, which quite often results in people voting against their own interests or even going against the very core of who they are. And I came across several scientists and doctors who identified some of these tactics.
We know he's got tons of weapons in his own country, and we're not going to ever locate them until he's gone.
At the time we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't.
He followed the rules, Bush did, and we lost that. We lost the weapons.
They never found weapons of mass destruction
They
in
had
Syria.
them, but they moved them. They were moving everything into Syria.
YouGov found that 63% of Republicans still believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction when the U.S. invaded in 2003.
What news shows often do is they'll cite a statistic or they'll cite a finding, but they won't really tell you where it's from. They won't tell you much about the study. They won't tell you who's compiling that statistic. They just kind of cite it out of thin air. Who's put the statistic out? Is this scientifically proven? Was it peer-reviewed? Who paid for it?
Fairleigh Dickinson University's Public Mind Survey asked 1,185 nationwide respondents what their news sources were, and then asked them about the events in the U.S. and abroad. Fox viewers got less right than people who watched no news at all.
They'll say something that's just blatantly, obviously false. I'll say, find me any legit source that backs you up, and fine, I'll believe it. They're like, oh, well, every single newspaper in America is run by liberal elites with an agenda. Well, okay, if the only news source that you can trust is Fox News, that sounds really paranoid.
The noise machine is really designed to create confusion, create misinformation, create fear. And so the Republican noise machine is when the Republican Party sort of works in concert with Fox News, with Rush Limbaugh, with AM talk radio. And it's really designed just to distract people, to attack and smear people. The absolute base of it is the deliberate dissemination of misinformation in order to confuse viewers and news consumers and get them all riled up.
I asked Eric to give me some examples of deliberate misinformation.
During the 2008 campaign, there was sort of this right-wing crusade about voter fraud and voter registration. And there's very little voter fraud, meaning someone shows up to the voting place and pretends to be somebody else to vote.
I mean, some of the worst things are the massive attempt to create climate change denial. Huge programs. American Chamber of Commerce, petroleum industry, they've announced publicly that they're carrying out propaganda, they probably call it educational programs, to explain to people that humans don't have anything to do with climate change and so on. But you got to make profit tomorrow. And if the species goes down the tube, that's somebody else's problem.
And the Arctic ice cap at the North Pole, it's in its so-called normal range. Not only is the ice not melting, more polar bears are alive and happy today than we've had in 100 years. Life is good, Miss Kelly. I got to tell you, life is good.
The goal is to get people so mad at each other that they, A, don't notice who's really causing their problems, B, they won't join together to oust the truly guilty parties, C, they're then capable of feeling nothing towards the group that's blamed.
John Haldeman, Nixon's famous chief of staff, went on the Today Show, said, all politics is the politics of division. The team that manages to divide the country and end up with the bigger side wins.
On one side, President Obama and the Democratic Party want America to become an entitlement state versus a self-reliant one.
With African Americans is that we're all on welfare. The assumption is that we can't get that without taking it from somebody else, and that's simply not true.
Welfare is very, very generous. You're not motivated to succeed because you are getting free stuff from the government. You are surrounded by goodies that are put onto you.
Well, as long as the government is supplying him the money just that he needs to live on, he's not interested in getting a job. So he'll go on year after year after year on the government dole and not bother getting a job.
Branding is about creating an image that will stick in the mind. Whether that image created is accurate or not doesn't matter. Democrats, liberals, and progressives are branded as big government spenders, dishonest, America-hating elitists who are all atheists who hate Christmas and are soft on crime and weak on defense. They've branded the media as liberal, so much so that it's taken for granted that it's true. One catchphrase that I hear over and over again is liberal media. Did you hear your dad?
All the time. I heard him use the term liberal media all the time. He'd be like, oh, you can't listen to liberal media. As if there was no such thing as the conservative media.
If you analyze news coverage, as FAIR has done, you find that the news tilts a little bit to the right. It's sort of center-right. Republicans usually outnumber Democrats. It's just pure math. And then people say, well, why do so many people believe the liberal media myth? If you keep handing opinion-shaping power to right-wingers who don't have evidence to yell about, oh, liberals, the liberals, the liberals, the liberals who dominate, well, it's going to have some traction.
The liberal media. Liberal media. Liberal bias.
Liberal media, folks.
Liberal press.
It is the liberal media.
And so he watches Fox News and he says to me, Fox News tells the stories that the liberal media does not want to air. And I think, yeah, but Fox News makes stuff up, you know? So no wonder you can hear things there that you won't hear in the so-called liberal media.
Language is not neutral. In politics, it's anything but neutral. This became professionalized in 1994 when Newt Gingrich hired Frank Luntz.
Frank is the genius right-wing wordsmith who taught Republicans to, instead of saying estate tax, say death tax.
So you have managed to shift popular opinion on a lot of unpopular everyday concepts like inherited wealth by labeling it death tax.
I have fought over the validity of the death tax since I started working in this space. And I went out and tested it, and my God, it changed the dynamic of how people looked at policy.
Instead of saying poor people, say the takers. Did I say don't tax rich people? I meant encourage the job creators. What's the difference between drilling for oil and energy exploration? Nothing, except one sounds like something assholes do and one sounds like Indiana Jones. Did I say don't let black people vote? I meant clamp down on voter fraud. Healthcare reform, everyone likes that. Government takeover of healthcare.
So I asked them, which frightens you more, government control or government takeover? Oh, clearly government takeover. Well, I think it was 27 out of 30. That's it.
Once the word is decided on, every single Republican, from the presidential contenders on down to the feces throwers on hate radio, all chant it like Rain Man over and over until it's beaten into our skulls.
The idea is to terrify and terrorize the audience during every waking moment. When people are afraid, they don't think rationally. And when they can't think rationally, they'll believe anything.
Fox News is built on this formula of just getting people really, really angry. It's this phony outrage machine. Particularly on Fox News, I mean, they really are actors, acting about how outraged they are.
Give me one damn program.
Anybody else a little pissed off by that?
Obama attacks America.
I'm more angry about it than you are.
I've told you that you need to be afraid because they are coming for you.
ISIS coming into America, I would bet my life on the fact they're already here. And I have caught these people before, and I've seen Korans, prayer rugs, you name it. They're already here.
A self-styled militia patrolling the Mexican-U.S. border contacted Breitbart.com and relayed the discovery of the rug Monday night just south of the Sierra Vista in Coronado National Forest. You want to know what it turned out to be? An Adidas jersey.
ISIS. I mean, they're here. They're here.
You think they're here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think they're waiting for the whistle to blow. They're going to come out and take over. I think that's what
this country?
I think they will. I really think they do. I'm scared for the country.
The effect of bullying is simple. It operates on two levels. One is it shuts the guest up if they're making a point that the bullier doesn't want the audience to hear.
Is Hamas, what part of this can't you get through your thick head? Is Hamas a terrorist organization? An orbital eye socket fracture.
Okay.
And eyewitnesses say that Michael Brown charged at him. You weren't there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I believe you cut my mic off.
And two, the fake outrage makes the bullier look justified as they try to shame their frustrated guest into silence.
Understand, you've got an agenda here. We just think that the American people ought to know.
Our agenda is to report the news fair and balanced, Bill. I understand you don't like it, and sometimes your candidate has complained about it. But that's what we're going to do. You may have the rest of the media in the tank, but Fox News reports it straight, fair and balanced, as always. Bill Burton, thanks so much for being here.
And he listens to Rush Limbaugh. They have on Fox News in almost every room.
Fox News 24/7.
We're just watching talking heads all day on Fox News.
All the homes in their neighborhood are tuned into Fox News all the time.
Fox News is on 24/7. Rush Limbaugh is on 5 days a week. There's Michael Savage, Alex Jones, The Mark Levin Show, The New York Post, The Wall Street Journal, Op-Ed, The Drudge Report, The Weekly Standard, Newsmax, Breitbart, American Spectator, Tea Party Express, and then there's the avalanche of conservative emails. Fox News can be found in hospitals, bus stations, gyms, airports, and even bars and restaurants.
The primary TV outlet for the right is Fox, and their audience is loyal. How loyal? Consistent liberals have an array of news sources according to Pew Research, whereas 47% of consistent conservatives tightly cluster around Fox News.
As far as talk radio goes, roughly 97% of talk radio stations are conservative, while only 3% are progressive.
Carol Wallen told me that Rush Limbaugh is being played on military bases. I wanted to know how that happened.
In 1993, Representative Robert Dornan gathered up 70 of his closest representative friends. He thought it was really important that Rush Limbaugh be played on the Armed Forces Network, that this was absolutely a necessity. But Robert Dornan himself is famous for the fact that he grabbed another representative's tie on the floor of the House and threatened him with bodily harm.
It's not just language, it's also visuals.
In his book, State of Confusion, Dr. Bryant Welsh says the sound and visual effects of Fox News are almost carnival-like, with their multiple crawlers and a seemingly constant state of news crises created by Fox News alerts. Then there are the more graphic images that strongly suggest a point they want to make. That image looks like it's saying that Hamas and Hollywood are one and the same. Ouch. Sometimes a camera movement is used to distract. On Fox, the colors are vivid and the graphics are overwhelming. It is more stimulating than most other news shows. It creates a mood that mesmerizes its audience and holds them captive. Then, while they are captive and overwhelmed and maybe a bit confused, they have someone like Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity, with their confidence and passionate certitude, telling them who they should blame for their confusion and uncertainty.
Each one of these gestures that I have helps communicate an idea or a principle, a thought, a fact, an emotion. You start with one hand first, and then you get the two. You count off with your finger, 1, 2, 3. The audience that you're speaking to is actually counting with you.
My dad started changing when this guy called Glenn Beck came on the air, and now he expects there's supposed to be some sort of civil war next year. He buys a lot of ammo, a lot of guns.
Why? What does he expect Obama to do?
I don't know, take over the world. He believes Obama and his administration is buying up all the ammo, and so that's why they have to buy the ammo before the government gets it all.
The savage mind will respond to authority if they are convinced that that authority is serious.
This is important for all of us, and we are tired. We want to come out of the shadows.
You have other people at the border who are here illegally, who are crossing over the border, and they're very much out of the shadows.
A long time ago, the feminazis began their quest to make women more like men, acquire power like us, have careers like us, all that.
Believe scientists? No.
All flights from West Africa should immediately be discontinued.
These guns don't fire themselves. Don't we have to deal with mental health, parenting?
Well, how did you start turning away from Rush Limbaugh?
In the late 90s, just playing around on the radio dial, I found I was driving to work one weekend, I had to go to work on a Saturday, had to be there by noon. And playing around the radio dial, I found a very, very funny show. It sounded like it was a lot of fun to listen to. It was Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on NPR. Never really listened to it before. And I discovered they had great shows on the weekends. And then through the week, I'd stop listening to Hannity at 3 to switch over to All Things Considered. I'm not going to sit here and say NPR has a left slant or a liberal bias, but I think their journalism is solid. And I started basically comparing the quality of how the information is presented and what I was being told, as opposed to, well, I guess I could start seeing the right-wing talk radio as what it is, sheer propaganda.
We went about trying to deprogram these people. I mean, the one thing that you didn't have to worry about a ditto head is knowing about the study at Tufts University saying a woman's bra size, the bigger her bra size, the lower her IQ. They'd heard all these stories. So it was in some sense easy to open them up when you say, well, you want to know something? There was no study at Tufts University. You know that story about Chelsea Clinton, Hillary and Bill Clinton's daughter, being forced to write an essay, Why I Feel Guilty Being White? There was no such essay. There was no such CBS News report saying there was an essay. So this begins to, the deprogramming begins when they realize that so much of what they believed was not true.
What the book does is it basically goes after Rush Limbaugh, looking at the things that he has stated as facts on his radio show and basically debunking them. And many of the pages have the format where it says Limbaugh, and then a quote, and then reality, and then our research. Where it was a highly technical or scientific issue, we'd go to experts and get them, and we'd quote them debunking Limbaugh. And it had a tremendous effect.
The name of our group is Flesh Rush. We listen to radio stations all over the country to monitor advertisers of Rush Limbaugh, and there's usually hundreds of us from all over the country. Over 3,000 advertisers are no longer aired on Rush Limbaugh's station.
What we call for is we want reform and restructuring. So where it can be done, we would like to see more progressive shows, more balance, more working people, the voices of working people in our commercial and our public broadcasting. I mean, it's just amazing that public broadcasting has almost no voices of disenfranchised people in it.
That's one of the beauties of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks
is really a form of journalism that's desperately needed in the existing system, because the mainstream media won't collect and report data such as WikiLeaks will collect. You have to have masses of people organizing and putting pressure on really what it amounts to is a revolution. I mean, some kind of political, economic, social revolution, because you have a powerfully embedded system. To change it significantly, change the media significantly, you have to have people organized and force a change.
There was so much misinformation that you had to wade through that we felt like it was really important to finally take that on directly. So much of the work that we do around different issues is around putting out fires, responding to this attack or this bad bill motivated by far-right ideologues. This is a problem that a whole lot of people are dealing with in different states, in different cities, in different communities. So, we're working at the grassroots, we're working one-on-one with people around their specific issues and situations to help them deal with that, because, these kind of changes have to happen person by person, family by family, interaction by interaction.
What they say about deprogramming, specifically, I think, with folks who get involved in cults, the bubble of conspiracy or misinformation with one fact. Right, that helps the entire artifice ultimately crumble.
If you're wondering what happened with my dad, here's the story. My parents moved to a senior community, and apparently during the move, my dad's kitchen radio broke. He never got around to fixing it, so it sat in the garage with the other broken radios. My parents started eating lunch together again, but he still watched Fox and still got the right-wing emails and snail mail. When the TV in the kitchen broke, they got a new one, and Mom programmed the remotes. He didn't want to bother to figure out how my mother programmed them, so he just watched whatever my mother watched. One time when he went in the hospital for a kidney stone, she asked me to weed out his emails to save some computer space. When I told her they'd just keep coming, she decided to unsubscribe him from some of the more extreme political emails. But then she got the idea of subscribing him to liberal and democratic ones. But much to our surprise, when he got back, he started reading them. What does he read now?
Truth Out, RSN News, all that stuff.
Yeah.
I've been listening to Rush Limbaugh for quite a few years. And of course, for some reason or other, I don't know what happened, I somehow got away from it. And, but before that, I had on all the time, the political chatter, but then I stopped.
He doesn't listen to Rush Limbaugh anymore, and he doesn't listen to Fox News.
Do you think your political views have changed?
Halfway between Republican and Democrat. Oh. Mm-hmm. I'm not all Democrat. I'm not all Republican.
Do you believe in the minimum wage?
Minimum wage, yes.
Do you believe in personal freedoms? Well, some people believe that gay people don't have the right to get married, and other people say I couldn't care less. Let them get married if they want to.
Well, I guess if they want to do that, they'll go ahead and do it, yeah.
Yeah, that's the way I figure.
I spoke to Uncle Frank the other day. It's hard to explain, but just a kindness in his voice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Happy birthday. Gene?
Yes.
I haven't seen you in so long.
I know. How you been?
I didn't recognize you.
Yeah.
Okay, so for starches, the other day, he surprised me. President Obama was on, he said to me, I kind of like him. And then later he said again at a different time, I like Obama. I thought, glory be.
He's a pretty good guy. Yeah, he's doing all right.
He's forgetting all that other stuff that he learned. And I guess whatever.
Mom would shut down his computer at night, and she started subscribing him to Truth Out and Alternet and reader-supported news.
Oh, and he would just read whatever ended up in his
He
inbox.
just read everything. And he's an avid reader. He sits at that computer and he reads whatever's in front of him.
Well, that's very interesting, and see, his thinking changed.
His politics have totally changed. He voted for Obama.
What? He voted for Obama?
In these past couple years, there's finally been peace in our house. My dad is more content than I've ever seen him. He's not angry, he's not argumentative, and he's really fun the way he used to be. And we get along really well, and I dote on him. In fact, I get along with him better than I ever have. And it's sort of a bittersweet pill because I know these are his last years, but I'm happy that he's happy. He is my pal, and I'm his.
Pytała się pani młodego doktora, czy lepiej dać rana, czy lepiej wieczora. A młody doktor jej mówił, dajcie jemu 2 razy.
So that is the story of Jen and her father. Her father had changed into a person none of them recognized or even liked. A persistent wife who continued to challenge her husband. It eventually made a difference.
I raz u wieczora. It's a mixture of Polish and Ukrainian. I mix them a lot.
You used to be very fanatical?
Yes.
Yeah.
I listened to him for a long time.
Yeah, but you're not as fanatical as that anymore. So that's what the movie is about how you used to be very fanatical and now you're much better.
I think I'd like to see that.
Yeah, you'll see it, Dad.
Yeah.
Well, they learned about Santa a long time ago. Little bunnies at Easter and pink unicorns. Tiny tooth fairies have lost their appeal, but they still think Fox News is real. My parents think Fox News is real. I tried to explain, but they just won't sit still. All that jumping and shouting has put them off keel. And my parents think Fox News is real. Well, now Bill's not your buddy, and the 5 aren't your friends. They're in it for money, they're just talking heads. Once was a time when I was amused, but now someone needs to give them the news. My parents think Fox News is real. I tried to explain, but they just won't sit still. All that jumping and shouting has put them off keel. And my parents think Fox News is real. Well, now if I could change things, you know that I would. But banging your head on a rock can't be good. Maybe just singing this song is a start. So for now, I'll just say bless their heart.